In a modest room in Washington, during the spring of 1907, a woman passed from this world without a single witness. No relatives gathered. No friends arrived to bid farewell. Above her bed, mounted on the wall, hung a solitary image, a photograph of Abraham Lincoln. She had entered the world as his property. By the hour of his death, she had become the sole person his wife trusted absolutely. Her name was Elizabeth Keckley. In the 35 nights following the assassination, she remained at Mary Todd Lincoln's side. Eventually, she composed a book, a volume that Lincoln's own son would spend years laboring to ensure you never laid eyes upon. This is the account of that book, and the woman who wrote it. MC Introduction. Welcome back to Behind the Throne. On the evening of April 14th, 1865, a courier raced through Washington streets. Ford's Theater lay scarcely 2 blocks behind him. Inside the boarding house known as Peterson's, Abraham Lincoln hovered between life and death. His wife, Mary Todd Lincoln, remained in the front parlor, inconsolable, barely lucid, recoiling from the touch of every senator and general who pressed forward to comfort her. The most powerful men in the nation stood helpless before her anguish. They dispatched the messenger to summon a dressmaker. The woman who answered that call was Elizabeth Keckley. At 53 years old, she had been born into bondage in Virginia. She had arrived in Washington less than a decade prior, with virtually nothing in her possession. She held no official position, no political standing, no formal role in the hierarchy of that terrible evening. But when she crossed the threshold of that parlor, Mary Lincoln reached out and seized her hands. For more than a month following Lincoln's passing, through the vigil, the funeral procession, the weeks when Mary refused to emerge from her White House chambers, Elizabeth Keckley was the sole person Mary would permit to enter. It is an extraordinary fact, and once you encounter it, it compels a far larger question. How does a woman born in bondage ascend to become the most trusted figure in the most powerful household in America? What friendship could possibly bridge such a chasm? And what does it truly cost? What is the actual price? To love someone across every boundary a nation has constructed between you. Tonight's narrative represents an effort to answer those questions. Elizabeth Keckley, when she is remembered at all, is recalled as a seamstress, the woman who stitched Mary Lincoln's gowns, a capable presence hovering in the background of a more consequential existence. That portrayal is incomplete, and it does her a grave injustice. She was born into slavery in 1818 in Dinwiddie County, Virginia. By the time she crossed the White House threshold, she had endured beatings, assault, and the death of her only son on a Civil War battlefield. She had purchased her own emancipation, cultivated a thriving dressmaking enterprise in Washington, and become the intimate confidant of a first lady who placed her trust in almost no one. And then she wrote a book. A book composed carefully, deliberately, with the explicit intention of rescuing someone else. A book that cost her nearly everything she had remaining. And that book, 300 quiet pages, became the instrument of her erasure from history entirely. We commence tonight where we must, at the origin, in a kitchen in Virginia, in the year Elizabeth Keckley turned 4 years old, when the world had already determined her worth. This is her story. Chapter 1. The Rod on the Wall. Dinwiddie County occupies the eastern portion of Virginia. Low country, tobacco territory, a landscape of flat fields and pine forests stretching toward the Appomattox River. By 1818, the county contained more enslaved souls than free citizens, and it had remained so for generations. This is where Elizabeth Keckley entered the world. She arrived in February of that year, in the quarters of the Burwell Plantation, property of Colonel Armistead Burwell. Her father, George Pleasant Hobbs, was enslaved on a neighboring estate. He visited when circumstances permitted, which was infrequently, and was sold away while Elizabeth was still a child. She spent years afterward receiving his letters. Brief, cautious notes passed through hands she could not always identify, and reading them until the paper disintegrated along its folds. Her mother, Agnes, worked in the Burwell household as a seamstress. This was significant, though Elizabeth did not yet grasp its full import. Agnes could cut, stitch, and complete garments with skill. When her daughter was old enough to sit still, she began to pass along her knowledge. But first came the kitchen. Elizabeth was 4 years old when she was assigned to watch an infant, the child of one of the white members of the household. She was careful. She leaned over the cradle with the intense focus a 4-year-old brings to something she has been told matters. She watched it. She was trying. The cradle tipped. The baby fell to the floor. The infant was uninjured. Elizabeth reached for it immediately. But the mistress was already in the doorway, and what followed was not measured against the baby's well-being or the child's intentions. It was measured against the fact that something belonging to the household had been damaged, or nearly so, and that a small girl stood nearby who could be held responsible. She survived it. She had no alternative but to survive it, and she filed it away with the particular precision of someone who understands. Even at 4 years old, that memory is one of the few possessions that cannot be confiscated. The Burwell household operated as thousands of Virginia households operated, with enslaved labor woven into every function, and with the understanding that those providing that labor existed entirely at the pleasure of those who owned them. The rules were not always articulated. They did not need to be. Elizabeth absorbed them the way children absorb language, through total immersion, through observation of consequence, through the constant quiet calibration of behavior against risk. At 7 years old, she witnessed something that rendered the logic of that world fully visible. When I was about 7 years old, she would write, decades later, I witnessed, for the first time, the sale of a human being, a boy named Little Joe, the son of the plantation's cook. A child she had known her entire short life, was the one selected that day. He was brought into the room, she recalled, with a bright face. He did not yet comprehend what was unfolding. He was placed on the scales. He was weighed. And he was sold, she wrote, like the hogs, at so much per pound. That Elizabeth watched. She was 7 years old, and she was watching the machinery operate. She understood, with the clarity that children sometimes possess for the cruelest realities, that the same scales existed for her, that her weight had been calculated before she could speak, and that the only question was when the transaction would arrive. This was not a lesson anyone taught her. It was a lesson demonstrated. She did not break. She sued. Her mother had been teaching her since she was old enough to hold a needle steady. And by her early teens, Elizabeth was already more skilled than most. She could cut cloth cleanly, manage fit, produce a finished seam that bore no resemblance to a child's work. In the Burwell household, this was useful. In the wider world she did not yet have access to, it would eventually become something more. But that remained years distant. First, there was North Carolina. In her early teens, Elizabeth was loaned, as enslaved people were routinely loaned, to the household of Reverend Robert Burwell. The family moved between Virginia and Hillsborough, North Carolina, and Elizabeth accompanied them. She packed what she owned, which was not much, and she went. Reverend Burwell's kitchen had a wall beside the door. On that wall hung a rawhide. Every morning before dawn, when she came to start the fire, she passed it. She did not look at it directly. There was no need. She knew its weight, its reach, the particular sound it made on the nail when someone lifted it down. It was not there as a reminder. It was simply there. The way a tool is there, practical, available, waiting. It was in that household that a man named William Bingham, the local school teacher, a man who prided himself on discipline, decided, for reasons Elizabeth could never satisfactorily explain, that she required correction. She had done nothing. She told him so directly, which was perhaps the quality that made him angrier. He seized a rope. He tried to bind her. Then, in her own words, he picked up the rawhide, and it cut the skin, raised great welts, and the warm blood trickled down my back. She did not plead. She did not weep, by her own account, until later. What she felt in the moment, as best as it can be understood from the careful, restrained prose she brought to every difficult thing, was something close to cold clarity. She was being punished for existing, and there was no court that would hear her case. What happened after was unexpected. Bingham wept. He was ashamed of himself, she wrote, ashamed. In the immediate aftermath of what he had done, he had beaten a girl who had done nothing wrong, and some part of him knew it. She recorded this without sentiment. She was not required to forgive anyone on a schedule. What she did, in the years that followed, was sue. In every household she was assigned to, in every town, her skill accumulated quietly. Merchants' wives heard about her. Women who wanted something better than what the local dressmaker could provide began to seek her out. She worked for no pay. Every cent belonged to whomever owned her at the time, but the skill was entirely hers. No one could take that. She was building something. She did not yet have a name for it. She was in her late 20s before she began to understand what suing might actually purchase. By then, she had been moved again, to St. Louis, Missouri, to the household of Hugh Garland, and she had a son, a boy named George, who had come into the world under circumstances she would carry in the deepest part of herself, quietly, for the rest of her life. But St. Louis was also where something shifted, where she looked, for the first time, at a number, a specific, ruthless number, and asked herself whether she could reach it. The number was $1,200, and it was the price of her freedom. Chapter 2, the $1,200. The boy was named George, and it was for him, as much as for herself, that she would eventually need every dollar of the $1,200. He was born around 1839, the son of Elizabeth and a white man named Alexander Kirkland, an associate connected to the household where she served. Elizabeth did not speak of how he was conceived, not then, and not for a long time afterward. What the record shows, in the careful language with which such things were documented, is that Kirkland's involvement was neither consensual nor contested by anyone with the power to intervene. George was light-skinned. Light enough, as Elizabeth noted with the matter of fact precision she brought to difficult things, that no one looking at him would immediately understand what the law said he was. Under Virginia's rule of partis sequitur ventrum, the condition of the child follows the condition of the mother. George's shade of skin was irrelevant. His mother was enslaved. Therefore George was enslaved. The calculation had been made before he drew his first breath. She loved him in the way that people love the thing they are most afraid of losing. She watched him carefully. She watched the world around him more carefully still. When a man named James Keckley came calling, presenting himself as free, with steady work and a composed manner, Elizabeth wrestled with the question of whether to accept him. Not because she lacked desire for companionship, but because she could not silence the thing she already knew. "I could not bear the thought," she wrote later, "or of bringing children into slavery." She married him anyway. She had her reasons, stability, perhaps, or the particular hope that comes from imagining something different. The marriage was not a good one. James Keckley turned out to be neither free nor particularly steady. He drank. He struggled. He was, in the end, more weight than anchor, and they eventually separated. Elizabeth kept his name. It was the name she had chosen, and she had chosen it deliberately, and she kept it the same way she kept everything, without ceremony, without apology. What she did not do in any of it was stop suing. In St. Louis, her reputation had spread quietly among the households of the families who formed the city's social tier. She was skilled in a way that could not be improvised. Her cuts were clean, her fits were careful, and she had an instinct for what a woman's silhouette needed that no formal training could have manufactured. Her clients sat in her workroom and trusted her with the clothes they wore to the most important occasions of their lives. She worked long hours. Everything she earned went to the Garland household. But her name was known, and in that knowledge lay the shape of an idea she had been quietly forming for years. She needed $1,200. The sum was not arbitrary. It was the figure that Hugh Garland had calculated for her freedom and George's. $1,200, and he would sign the papers. It was a large amount, more than she could accumulate alone, even if she had been permitted to keep what she earned. She would need help, so she asked. She went to the women she had dressed, the women who had stood in her workroom while she pinned their hems, who had trusted her judgment about cut and color and fit. She explained what she needed. She asked if they would lend it to her. 17 of them said yes. There was no contract any court would honor, no security beyond her word. What those 17 women extended to her was something closer to faith than credit. A quiet, informal recognition of what she was and what she was trying to do. She took it. She tracked every dollar with the precision of someone who understood that a single default would define her character for the rest of her life. On the 15th of November, 1855, she placed $1,200 on a table in a small parlor in St. Louis, in coins and notes, gathered over months of calculation. Hugh Garland signed the manumission paper for her and for George. She did not weep until she left the building. She stepped out into the November air, and she stood there for a moment awed, and then she allowed herself that. The loans were repaid, all 17 of them, systematically, over the years that followed. Not one creditor was left waiting longer than she could manage. This is the kind of fact that gets lost in a story about survival. The sheer, deliberate precision of a woman who could have let some debt slide and chose not to. She was free now. George was free, and in the years that followed, she worked her way steadily toward a city she had been hearing about for some time. By the spring of 1860, she was in Washington. She had arrived with $2.50 and a willingness to work harder than anyone expected. She opened a small dressmaking shop. She built a clientele. Washington was full of women who needed skilled work done and were willing to pay for it. She did not know, in those first months, that one of them would change the course of everything. Chapter 3. Madame Elizabeth. The first time, Elizabeth Keckley walked into the Willard Hotel, where the Lincoln family was staying in the days before the inauguration. She went at the request of a woman she had never met. Mary Todd Lincoln had heard about the dressmaker on 12th Street. Reputation traveled quickly in Washington among the households where appearance carried social weight, and the work Elizabeth produced could not be improvised. By late February of 1861, Mary had been given the name. The initial meeting was practical, a question of fabric, timelines, and inaugural gowns. But something else happened in that workroom conversation. Mary Lincoln was a woman with strong opinions about nearly everything, and she recognized quickly a woman who shared that quality. The professional arrangement began, and then it deepened. By summer, Elizabeth was in the White House regularly, not only for fittings, the constant production required by public life, but increasingly for other reasons. Mary talked to her, not about fabric, but about the pressures of the White House, the isolation that came with being observed constantly and understood rarely, the loneliness that no official account was required to acknowledge. She called her Elizabeth. She said the name with something that sounded like genuine affection. Abraham Lincoln called her something different. He noticed her, the composed woman who moved quietly through the rooms of his household, and formed his own assessment. He called her Madame Elizabeth, said it with a slight gravity, as if the honorific were entirely appropriate. Elizabeth found this, she later wrote, more meaningful than he perhaps intended. Then the war came to her directly. Her son George had enlisted in the Union Army that spring. He went as a white soldier. His light skin made this possible, and was assigned to the 1st Missouri Light Artillery. On August 10, 1861, he was killed at the Battle of Wilson's Creek in Missouri. He was 21 years old. The news arrived by letter. Elizabeth raided in her workroom on 12th Street, in the place where she had built everything she had. According to her memoir, a visitor came to the shop that afternoon, a tall man in a stovepipe hat who entered quietly and sat down without ceremony. He did not speak for a moment. Then he took her hands. The President of the United States sat with the woman who dressed his wife, and offered no condolences that would have been too small for the occasion. He simply stayed. She buried her grief and returned to work. She did not know how else to move through it. 6 months later, it was Mary Lincoln's turn. Willie Lincoln, the president's second son, 11 years old, died of typhoid fever in the White House on February 20th, 1862. He had been ill for weeks. When it was over, Mary did not stand in any doorway. She collapsed entirely. Elizabeth was sent for. She arrived to find the First Lady in a state of devastation that no official phrase could adequately contain. Unable to eat, unable to speak to most people, unable to enter the rooms of the White House where Willie had been alive. She would not go near the green room, where his body had been embalmed. She sat in near darkness and refused to be managed by anyone. She was an altered woman, Elizabeth wrote later. She never again went into the guest room where her son died or the green room where he was embalmed. Elizabeth sat at the foot of Mary's bed and did not leave. She did not fill the silence with comfort, because she understood that certain silences could not be filled. She had sat alone with her own grief in a workroom on 12th Street 4 months earlier. She knew what the shape of it required. She stayed. Day after day, she stayed. It was during those weeks that Mary Lincoln wrote a letter to her husband. If it had not been for Lizzie Keckley, she told him plainly, I do not know what I should have done. She meant it without embellishment. One afternoon, Lincoln came to sit with his wife. The windows were still drawn, the White House still wrapped in its private mourning. Elizabeth was in the room. Lincoln rose, walked to the window, and pointed through the glass toward a large white building visible on the hill across the river. He spoke to Mary directly. Mother, he said, and Elizabeth later recorded these words with careful precision. Do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there. He was pointing at the government hospital for the insane. Elizabeth wrote this down. She was a witness. She wrote what she heard, and left the interpretation for later, in the way she left most things. careful, precise, waiting for the moment when the meaning would become fully clear. She could not have known, standing in that room in the winter of 1862, that the moment would come. That Lincoln's quiet warning would prove, in the end, to be a prophecy. That what he feared for Mary would happen, and that when it did, it would not be a stranger who arranged it. But that was still years away. For now there was the war, and the White House, and the friendship forged in the rooms, where other people's grief burned hottest. 3 years remained. 3 years in which Elizabeth would stand at Mary's side through more losses than either of them could imagine. The last of those losses would not take years. It would arrive in a single night, with a pistol shot and a messenger running through dark streets, and a parlor full of powerful men who did not know what to do. Chapter 4. 5 weeks in a dark room. The messenger found her at home, alone. On the night of April 14th, she dressed quickly. A black physician named Dr. Anderson R. Abbott, the first licensed black doctor in Washington, was waiting outside to escort her. The city was not safe to cross alone at 2 in the morning, and whoever had sent for her had thought of this. They walked together through streets still lit by gas lamps, past darkened storefronts and silent government buildings, toward the east side of Pennsylvania Avenue. The boarding house called Peterson's sat directly across from Ford's Theater. When they arrived, Elizabeth could see light in the upper windows. She went inside. The parlor was full of men, generals, cabinet members, personal staff, the full machinery of power, stalled and helpless. Mary Lincoln was in the front room, barely coherent. She had already been brought into the back bedroom once to stand at her husband's bedside, and had fainted and been carried out again. The doctors did not want her near him when the end came. When Elizabeth walked through the door, Mary reached for her. Abraham Lincoln died at 7:20, 2 in the morning on April 15th, 1865. Elizabeth was in the boarding house when it happened. She heard the sounds move through the rooms, the shift in pace, the particular silence that follows a doctor stepping back from a bed, and she knew. What she did next was hold on. For the 35 nights that followed, Elizabeth slept in Mary Lincoln's room in the White House. This was not a symbolic arrangement. Mary would not function without her. She refused food for long stretches, refused to receive most visitors, refused to enter rooms she had moved through every day for 4 years. The East Room, where Lincoln's body lay in state, she could not bring herself to pass. She lay in the family quarters, while the official mourning proceeded through the floors below, and Elizabeth sat beside her in the dark and did not leave. The White House staff came and went. Officials arrived with condolences and departed with paperwork. Robert Lincoln, the eldest son, Harvard, educated, composed by temperament and training, managed the arrangements with the controlled grief of a man who had decided that composure was the only useful thing he could offer. Mary did not want Robert in those weeks. She wanted Elizabeth. By late May, she had to leave. A new president needed the house. She was given 5 weeks, longer than protocol required. But the end was inevitable. She packed slowly. She was a woman sorting through the remnants of a life that had been, for all its suffering, the center of a world. Elizabeth helped her pack. She moved between the trunks and the wardrobes and the stacked hat boxes, folding and wrapping, and she did not speak much, because there was nothing useful to say. What she carried out of those rooms with her hands, the gowns, the shawls, the objects that had filled 4 years of a presidency, was also what she carried out in her memory. She had been in these rooms when the decisions of a century were being made. She had sat in a darkened bedroom while Lincoln and his wife argued and reconciled and grieved. She had been there for all of it. And now she was folding it into trunks and carrying it down the stairs. Mary went to Chicago, then to other cities, circling without settling, reduced by grief and increasingly consumed by a fear of financial ruin. The Lincoln estate was being managed by Robert, and Mary believed, with a conviction that bordered on obsession, that she would die in poverty. She wrote to Elizabeth constantly. She needed reassurance, needed presence, needed the one person who had stood beside her in every dark room. Elizabeth answered every letter. In the autumn of 1867, the two women formed a plan that Elizabeth would later describe with the careful restraint of someone recounting a disaster they could not have prevented. Mary needed money. She had gowns, dozens of them, the official wardrobe of 4 years as First Lady, and she believed they were worth something. They traveled to New York together in September, to a consignment dealer on Broadway, to arrange a quiet sale. It was not quiet. Within days, the dealer had advertised to the press, and the press had made of it exactly what it had the appetite to make a spectacle. The former First Lady of the United States, selling her dresses in a back room on Broadway. The coverage was merciless. It was not intended to be anything else. Mary returned to Chicago exposed and humiliated. The gowns that had cost thousands produced almost nothing. Public opinion, which had tolerated her grief for 2 years, curdled almost overnight into something harsher. She was called calculating, grasping, undignified. She was, as she wrote to Elizabeth afterward, no longer anything. Elizabeth came home to Washington with a question she could not stop turning over. She had watched Mary Lincoln be misunderstood for years. Misread by the press, misread by the public, reduced to a caricature of an unstable widow. She had been in the rooms where the real Mary existed, complicated, wounded, capable of extraordinary loyalty, and she was tired of the distance between what she knew and what the world believed. She had carried one skill since childhood. She had always known how to make something from nothing, using only her hands. She began to write. Chapter 5, the book that was meant to save her. The book had a preface. Most books have prefaces, but this one began with an acknowledgement that was also, in a way, a defense. Not of the writing, but of the necessity of it. I am well aware that I have invited criticism, Elizabeth wrote, in the opening pages of the work that would become her most important and most destructive act. If I have betrayed confidence in anything I have published, it has been to place Mrs. Lincoln in a better light before the world. She meant every word. She had not written the book to expose anything. She had written it to defend. 3 years had passed since Lincoln's assassination, and in those 3 years, the public had made of Mary Todd Lincoln something between a cautionary tale and a figure of contempt. The dress sale in New York had finished what grief had started. The woman Elizabeth knew, the woman who had sat up at midnight composing letters to her husband, who had organized relief efforts for freed people, while the war was still being fought, who had held her sons while they were dying and been held, in turn, by no one she trusted, had been replaced, in the popular imagination, with a caricature. Elizabeth picked up her pen and wrote 300 pages in her own defense of the woman the world had decided to discard. The book was called Behind the Scenes, or 30 Years a Slave and 4 Years in the White House. It was published in the spring of 1860, by G.W. Carleton and Company in New York. Carefully written, scrupulously hedged where hedging was required. A first-person account of her life and her years inside the White House. The grief, the friendship, the trust extended between two women across an impossible distance. She had shaped every sentence deliberately, choosing what to include and what to leave in silence. She had not reviewed the final appendix. What she found there when the printed copies arrived stopped her. The publisher had appended 24 of Mary Lincoln's private letters. Letters Mary had written to Elizabeth over the years of their friendship. Personal, unguarded, written in the shorthand of two people who had stopped performing for each other. Letters about money, about her sons who had died, about Robert, about what she feared. They had been shared with the publisher as background material, as context for the narrative, not as content. No one had asked Mary's permission. No one had told Elizabeth they would appear in print. When Mary Lincoln read her own words in a published book available for purchase in New York, Washington, and Chicago, she experienced it as the final, absolute betrayal. It did not matter that Elizabeth had not authorized the letters. It did not matter that they had been submitted in good faith. What mattered was that her most private words were now public property, and the woman whose name was on the cover was the woman she had trusted them to. She cut Elizabeth off entirely. She never wrote to her again. She never saw her again. The press did the rest. The pretensions of an ignorant Negro mantua maker, wrote a reviewer for the New York Citizen in the spring of 1868, with the casual cruelty of someone who understood that certain people could be dismissed in a single phrase. Other publications followed. The book was not reviewed on its merits. It was reviewed on the impertinence of its existence. A black woman, formerly enslaved, daring to write with authority about the interior life of a first lady. Elizabeth's dressmaking clients began to disappear. The women who had stood in her workroom for years, who had recommended her across Washington's social network, found reasons to go elsewhere. One by one, then in clusters. The business she had built from $2.50 collapsed within months of publication. Robert Todd Lincoln, Mary's eldest son, a lawyer, a Harvard man, a future Secretary of War, quietly acquired the remaining copies of Behind the Scenes. Historians who have documented this period, including Jennifer Fleischner in her account of the two women's friendship, have established that Robert took sustained and deliberate steps to remove the book from circulation. The reason he gave was his family's dignity. What he did not mention, what the book itself contained, sitting quietly in 300 pages that fewer and fewer people would ever read, was something else entirely. Deep in the chapter about Willie Lincoln's death, in the winter of 1862, Elizabeth Keckley had recorded what she witnessed in the White House family quarters. She had been in the room. She had written it down with the precision she brought to everything that mattered. Lincoln had walked to the window. He had pointed at the large white building on the hill across the river. And Elizabeth later recalled that he had said, in words she transcribed carefully, "Mother, do you see that large white building on the hill yonder? Try and control your grief, or it will drive you mad, and we may have to send you there." He had been pointing at the government hospital for the insane. In the spring of 1875, 7 years after Robert Lincoln removed the book from circulation, Robert Lincoln had his mother committed. He arranged the legal proceedings himself. He hired the doctors. He managed what the newspapers were told. Mary Todd Lincoln spent months confined in a private asylum in Batavia, Illinois, before her sister secured her release. Her husband had warned her in 1862 at a White House window. Elizabeth Keckley had written it down in 1868 in the only published eyewitness account those private rooms ever produced. What the book had always contained from its first printing was a witness. And what historians have observed since, examining the sequence of events, is that the one document Robert Lincoln chose to suppress was the one that recorded, in a living hand, what Lincoln himself had feared would happen to his wife. The witness had been discredited. The book had been buried, and Elizabeth Keckley returned to Washington with nothing left to lose. She kept one photograph on her wall. Epilogue: the photograph on the wall. The photograph stayed on the wall after the book failed, after the clients disappeared, after the dressmaking shop on 12th Street closed for the last time and the workroom was cleared of its fabrics and its forms. Through all of it, Elizabeth Keckley kept the portrait of Abraham Lincoln in whatever room she occupied, in whatever city she found herself, through the decades that followed the loss of everything else. A pension arrived each month from the federal government. $8, later raised to $12, in recognition of the fact that her son George had died in Union service at Wilson's Creek in 1861. It was a small recognition of an enormous fact. She received it without comment. In the early 1890s, she was offered a position at Wilberforce University in Ohio, head of the Department of Sewing and Domestic Science. She accepted. She packed the photograph and went. The students who knew her there remembered a woman of composed authority. She taught what she knew the way she had learned it, precisely, with an insistence on correctness that came not from perfectionism, but from an understanding that skilled work was one of the few things the world could not easily take from you. She had learned that before she was 10 years old. In 1893, she suffered a stroke. She resigned her post at Wilberforce and returned to Washington. She had always returned to Washington. The city had been the center of her life. The shop, the White House, the decades of work. And it was where she understood herself to belong, even now. There was a place in Washington she could go. She had helped to found it herself in 1862, when the capital was filling with the displaced and the desperate. Women and children, black and uprooted, with nowhere and no one. The organization she had helped build, through the Ladies' Contraband Relief Association, and the years of fundraising that followed, had become the national home for destitute, colored women and children. She went there in the last years of her life and asked to be taken in. She lived in a small room. She received occasional visitors. She accepted the monthly pension. She did not speak often of the book, or of Mary Lincoln, or of the White House years. What she had witnessed, she had written down, and what she had written had been buried. And there was nothing left to add to the record that anyone had shown any interest in keeping. The photograph of Abraham Lincoln hung on her wall. On May 26, 1907, Elizabeth Hobbs Keckley died in that room. She was 89 years old. She had outlived Lincoln by 42 years. She had outlived Mary Todd Lincoln by 25. She had outlived her son by 46. She had outlived the dressmaking shop, the book, the friendship, and the 24 letters that had ended it. She was buried at Harmony Cemetery in Washington in 1875, 2 years before Mary Lincoln was finally released from the asylum her son had placed her in. A reporter had asked Robert Todd Lincoln about the book, about whether it was true that he had worked to remove it from circulation. Robert did not confirm or deny. He spoke, as he always spoke on such matters, about his family's dignity. The book remained difficult to find for decades. It was not republished in full until 1935. Elizabeth Keckley was not studied seriously, in any academic sense, until the latter half of the 20th century. In 1960, the city of Washington made plans to develop the land where Harmony Cemetery stood. The graves were to be relocated. 37,000 of them, the accumulated debt of generations of black Washingtonians. It was a large undertaking. Many of the graves had no markers. Some of the records were incomplete. In the process of moving 37,000 people, certain names were lost. Elizabeth Keckley's grave was among them. In 2010, 103 years after she died in that small room, a commemorative marker was placed at National Harmony Memorial Park in Maryland. It tells visitors her name. Her actual resting place has never been found,